Okay, I think we're ready to get started. This session is about customizing Windows 10 image creation tips and tricks. My name is Mike Niehaus. It's my second and last session for this event, so I'll be glad when this one is done. I can become an attendee at that point. So let's start off and talk about just kind of the basics. What is the perfect Windows 10 image? Really, no Windows 10 image. It would be using the install.wim off of the original Windows 10 media because it will never get smaller, it will never get simpler, it will never get easier. So, that said, the challenge is if you do that type of a deployment where you're using the install.wim directly, not making any type of modifications, that means you have to make modifications on the fly as you're doing the deployment of that image, which is certainly doable. It just requires potentially doing more work, and that more work generally translates into more time during the deployment process. So if time weren't an issue, we would say, forget custom images, we're just going to do a deployment, and as part of the deployment, we're going to do these customizations. So images should be about saving time, and to a certain extent, maybe saving some network traffic because you can get things bundled and compressed and reasonably well inside of that image. But for the most part, it's about saving time, trying to get the time that is required to deploy an OS to an existing PC down to the minimum. Now, when we talk about deploying Windows 10, we generally look at three different scenarios and options that are available for these scenarios. I talked about this a little bit yesterday, so this is really just a twist on the same conversation that we had yesterday. If you're coming from Windows 7, Windows 8, or Windows 8.1, and you're moving to Windows 10 on those existing devices, we prefer using In-Place Upgrade. What image can you use with In-Place Upgrade? The install.wim, that's it. You have to use the original install.wim from media with very minor modifications that are allowed to it, like removing some of the inbox apps. You can do a traditional image-based deployment, wipe and load style, but that is going to be more work because it's then the responsibility of that process to reinstall apps, re-inject drivers, and to do the type of configuration that we're talking about here today. If we're talking about brand new PCs, our goal is to get to the point where we can deploy a brand new PC that comes with Windows 10 on it without immediately wiping Windows 10 off of it and laying down a new custom image. Are we 100% there yet? Maybe not, that there is more work that needs to be done to make that a better process and to make that quick and easy, but we will get there in the near term. But in the meantime, okay, if you want to do wipe and load on those existing PCs, on those new PCs, you can do that. Once you get onto Windows 10, using custom images and doing wipe and load deployments to try to stay up to date with each Windows 10 release as it comes out is just not possible. There's no way you can keep up by completely wiping and reloading all of your Windows 10 PCs every 6 months or so. It's just too much work, too much heavy lifting, and it really isn't practical. So as a result, you do need to move to an in-place upgrade process to deploy Windows 10 feature updates. You can just do this one last round of wipe and load deployments to get to Windows 10. You can continue to do wipe and load deployments for brand new PCs, but after you're on Windows 10, staying current means in-place upgrade for feature updates. So let's push all that aside for a minute and talk about creating a Windows 10 image. Because you're obviously here because you've already said, no, we can't do modern deployment. We're not there yet. In-place upgrade, maybe we'll start doing that once we get to Windows 10, but we want a Windows 10 golden image. We're going to start from that point. So starting from that point, we need to make sure that we meet the requirements for building and deploying Windows 10. First, the assessment and deployment kit, the ADK. We ideally want to use the latest and greatest because that's the version that's been tested with the latest and greatest Windows 10 release. Every time we come out with a new Windows 10 release, we'll release a new ADK that goes along with it. So that's currently the 80K for Windows 10 1607. That works great in most scenarios. Although if you really want to, you can use the 80K from 1511 to create a 1607 image as well. So either of those will work okay for the latest Windows 10 release. If you're using Config Manager, generally they test the latest 80K with the latest Config Manager release, so staying current is good. There were some issues in the 80K for Windows 10 1511 that caused some things to break in Config Manager. Those were fixed in the 80K for 1607. The 80K for 1607 broke some new things like 8021X support and some of the driver injection required for Windows 7 on Config Manager due to some timing changes in the boot images. So make sure you test, but generally if you're using MDT to build your images, which is generally what we would recommend, then using the latest 80K is going to work the best. I said at the time when these slides were created that MDT 2013 Update 2 was recommended, but we've actually had a new MDT release since then, MDT 8443. We dropped the year and update number because it seemed kind of silly to release new versions that said MDT 2013 on them because it's well past 2013. But because of some support lifecycle challenges, we didn't want to call it MDT 2016 or MDT 2017 because we still needed to support old versions for anyone who's willing to admit that they're still deploying Windows Vista. There is still a version of MDT that's supported for deploying Windows Vista, so we had to keep an older version around for that. If we were to rename MDT 2013 to 2017, then that actually causes that Vista version to drop from support based on our support lifecycle. So forget that. We'll just drop the year from it and we'll just call it MDT. So now it's MDT. The build number is 8443. It's really no different than MDT 2013 Update 2, except for more bug fixes. The biggest changes in MDT, when we released MDT 2013 Update 2, there were some changes to the partitioning logic. Those changes caused some issues. We then made further changes in MDT 8443 to make it a little bit more explicit as far as disk partitioning goes. With previous versions of MDT, it would create, well, the step would actually say to create a single partition with 100% of the disk size, and then depending on whether you were deploying UEFI or BIOS, it would figure out what partition layout really is required and dynamically do the right thing. With 8443, we've changed the formatting and partitioning steps to have two of them, one for BIOS machines and one for UEFI machines with conditions on them that cause the appropriate one to execute. So more explicitly specifying, here's the disk layout that we want for both of those different types of deployments. If you have older task sequences created in MDT 2013 Update 1, MDT 2013 Update 2, or really anything older than MDT 8443, that other style of using the single format and partition drive step with a 100% partition will still work because there's fallback logic in MDT that says anytime you see that, translate it into the right thing for BIOS versus UEFI. But we would still generally suggest that once you've upgraded to MDT 8443, consider creating new task sequences so that you can pick up the new format and partition disk steps that are easier to customize if you wanted to have slightly larger partitions for, say, a UEFI boot environment, or if you wanted to adjust the size of the recovery partition. In those steps, we made some adjustments to the recovery partition as well. The Windows group has always suggested that you create a recovery partition. In Windows 10, the recovery partition doesn't actually hold a recovery image. It just contains a boot image. The recommended location for that recovery partition is at the end of the disk. You do run into some weird things with MDT and Config Manager when you want to create a partition at the end of the disk, but have it as a fixed size. I mean, you just can't do that in the format and partition disk step. So the disk step will actually say 1%, or effectively 1%. What it really ends up saying is create the initial fixed partitions, then use 99% of the remaining disk space for the operating system, and then the remaining 100% of what's left for the recovery partition. So that recovery partition size can vary quite a bit just based on the size of the disk, which is less than ideal, but unfortunately, in order to make the Windows team happy and create the recovery partition at the end, you have to have that slightly varying size created. If you're really concerned about that, you can shuffle the partition orders around. You can also try to dynamically calculate what that size should be and use fixed sizes that are dynamically specified based on the size of the disk, but most people don't even worry about it because, hey, it's 1%, it's just kind of a rounding error on the disk. It does create a problem potentially on PCs that have really small disks, because 1% of a really small disk might not actually be big enough to hold a large boot image that you're using for recovering. So if you add PowerShell and a whole bunch of other things, that boot image gets too big and therefore it won't fit on that partition. So you might need to make a tweak to go 98% and then 100% in order to leave enough space on that partition. So it's not a perfect partitioning setup, but it works out okay. WSUS is useful when you're creating images because then you don't have to worry about downloading updates and importing them into MDT to be injected into the image as part of the deployment. You can have a WSUS server with approve updates in it and just point MDT to that WSUS server and tell it to install all updates that are approved in the server. Or if you don't really care about what updates get installed, just point your build environment to Windows Update. Don't configure it with WSUS at all, and let it install all the current updates for the operating system, because then you'll be fully patched at that point in time. It is useful if you're going to build an image anyway to make sure that image is fully patched as part of the update process. If you're using Config Manager to build an image, that's fine. The challenge with building images with Config Manager is when you get into the default user profile customization. That doesn't work very well in Config Manager since everything in Config Manager runs as local system. It's pretty hard to modify the user profile when you're running as local system. MDT runs as the local administrator account, so the modifications you make to the default user profile, when you enable copy profile in the unattend.xml, that administrator profile automatically becomes the default user profile. So it's much easier to do profile type changes using MDT versus Config Manager. The hope, though, is once you've created an image, now you want as much automation as possible to deploy it. So throw it over the wall to the Config Manager team, have that deployed via Config Manager using task sequences. The Config Manager support statement around Windows 10 says that they support N-1 releases of Config Manager with each Windows 10 release. So Windows 10 1607 came out at the time that Config Manager 1606 was the current release. So they support full Windows 10 1607 functionality with 1606 and basic compatibility with 1602. When the next Windows 10 release comes out later, well, I would say spring, but really in the next few months, that release will require at least Config Manager probably 1702, which would be the next one that's going to be coming out, or the one that came out back in October, the 1610 release of Config Manager. So staying up to date with Config Manager is important to make all that work. From a KMS perspective, I assume you want to be able to activate this OS. So you need to make sure that you have a KMS server that supports Windows 10. That's supported by default in Windows Server 2016. So if you've moved to that, you're okay. If you're running any older KMS server, you need to install hotfixes onto it and then inject the appropriate KMS key. We had initially released keys with the initial Windows 10 1507 release. Those supported activation of Windows 10 plus LTSB 2015. When Windows Server 2016 released, we released new keys. Those new keys are required for Server 2016 and for LTSB 2016, but not the CB and CBB releases of Windows 10. So if you were okay with Windows 10 1507, you're still okay now. So you only need to worry about it with LTSB and Server 2016. From a general suggestions perspective, your life is simpler if you build an image in a disconnected environment. Now that means pointing to Woo and getting all your updates from Windows Update is a non-option because you're blocking access to that. But it avoids challenges that you can probably avoid in other ways, but things that happen asynchronously in the background on Windows can get in the way of your image creation process, like app updates. If you're keeping some of the inbox apps around in the operating system and you're trying to create an image while the store in the background is updating these apps, well, weird things can happen if you catch it at the wrong time. The sysprepping and capturing of the image can fail if there's a newer version of the app installed for the current user that's not provisioned on the machine. So you can see odd sysprep failures in cases even if you were trying to remove those apps, because it's possible that you could try to remove the app while it's trying to update itself, and even though you successfully removed it, the store put it back again with a later version, and then sysprep blows up. Removing internet access certainly solves that challenge. It makes sure that those background activities don't get in the way. We do occasionally release updated media. We initially released Windows 10 1607 as a CB release. When we declared it as CBB, we then released updated media. That updated media actually came out in late January. The only difference between the original media and the updated media is the injection of the November Patch Tuesday update. So it's patched media, it just has a slightly later version of the code, basically has all the latest fixes as of that point in time. Now that's instantly out of date because servicing keeps marching forward and there are later cumulative updates. You could mount the install.wim and inject those later updates in yourself, or just point to WSUS and pick them up from there, point to Woo, get them from there, or download them from the Windows Update catalog, import them into MDT, and off you go. We had a problem with Windows 10 1607. The original Windows 10 1607 media had some crashing bugs in the Windows Update agent. And as a result, if you pointed MDT at a WSUS server and told MDT to get the latest updates from WSUS, the Woo agent would crash, and that step in the MDT task sequence would then hang forever. So your image would just sit at installing Windows Update for days, weeks. You'd finally have to just kill it. So using the updated media avoids that because it will have the fixes for that already injected into it. You could work around that problem if you downloaded at least the October cumulative update, imported that into MDT, and then did a deployment where that would get injected into the OS before it booted for the first time. Then it would be able to successfully talk to WSUS. There were two separate issues. Both of them were resolved in the September and October updates, so that's why the November updated media works fine without those problems. Generally, we would say, well, don't wait for the media. You can go ahead and create your images without it. Just make sure you patch it, but making sure that that you have a version that works okay with the image creation process is generally useful. We do see a lot of organizations that get way too carried away with the types of customizations that are done to images. You shouldn't be tweaking every single part of the operating system, especially things that we don't provide tools or policies to control. I mean, importing random registry entries into the operating system because you want File Explorer to be in detail view instead of small icon view it's the type of customization that we would look at and say, well, why are you bothering? That's really kind of a user preference. You want to enable the user to be able to change that, but you don't really need to change every little part of the OS. Now, there are some things that you do need to change, and things like the start menu layout, if you want to get rid of some of the placeholder tiles that we'll take a look at later. But we don't want you to have to spend weeks or months customizing every Windows 10 release, because we're going to come out with these about twice per year. You really don't have time to be making all of those manipulations as we release each of these versions. We do see that a lot of organizations will take advantage of new Windows releases to deploy other stuff. So as you're moving from, say, Windows 7 to Windows 10, let's upgrade Office, let's upgrade Adobe Reader, let's upgrade SAP, let's upgrade everything that we're running on our standard desktop, which is okay. You just have to think about this as you move into a Windows as a service world and you start updating Windows 10 every 6 months. You're not going to have that opportunity anymore. So you need to have a separate mechanism for keeping those inbox apps up to date, not having to rely on new OS deployment processes in order to update those. Browsers become an interesting conversation as well. Our recommendation would be to use Edge as the primary browser, and then set up enterprise mode rules that cause any older incompatible non-HTML5 web pages to get redirected to IE. So you can use IE for the old crusty stuff and use Edge for all the modern HTML5 native web pages. That works really well. Over time, hopefully the usage of IE continues to shrink and Edge supplants it as the primary browser that most people use. The policies that we have in place with enterprise mode let you do two things. One is automatically redirect web pages from Edge to IE when they're not compatible. And now with Windows 10 1607, actually redirect compatible pages back to Edge so that people don't flip to IE and then never come back. So we've got those policies in place, but then we also have the additional controls for IE where you can say, this web page requires this specific document mode or this specific emulation type in order to get the correct behavior even within IE. So lots of abilities within enterprise mode to configure the details of that. We do see some organizations that say, no, we're not going to worry about that yet. We're just going to use IE as our default browser. It's kind of messy. It can be done. You can change the default file associations to make IE the default browser instead of Edge. You can't get rid of Edge. You can try to break it. You can try to remove it, but there's no supported way to get rid of Edge. It will always be there. There are some things inside of Windows 10 that, regardless of what the default browser is, will still launch Edge. Things like Cortana. When Cortana searches for something and you click on a link, it's going to launch Edge. So there are some things that Edge is needed to keep. You need to keep it around for those types of activities. I mentioned recovery images. We don't support full recovery images anymore. You can't have a WIM file on the machine that's used to recover the machine when you reset it. So anytime you do a reset from the settings app inside of Windows 10, it's going to completely reconstruct the operating system from the WinSXS folder structure. All of the individual Windows components will be resurrected to bring the operating system back to effectively the point that it was at the point that you did the reset. That reset will discard any driver updates that have happened within the last 30 days. It will discard any patches that have been installed in the last 30 days. It will get rid of pretty much all the apps that were on the system. It can reapply a provisioning package to the machine to put some of that stuff back, but if it's your own custom deployed image, there's not going to be a provisioning package. So a reset is going to give you a very bare operating system. It's Windows 10 and it's not much else. It's patched, it's fully up to date, minus the 30 days because you might be resetting to fix a problem. So we don't want to make it completely up to date, because that would bring back the same problem that you were probably resetting it to solve. So keep that in mind. You can't put a custom recovery whim on the machine anymore. We just don't have support for that in the operating system. We used to call the new style of applications by a variety of different things. We couldn't make up our minds what they should be called. Now we call these Universal Windows Apps, UWPs. They used to be called modern apps. There were a few other terms that we're not allowed to legally mention anymore, but you get the idea that these are the new style of apps that are included in Windows 8 and above. Universal Windows apps are different than other types of apps because of the way they're installed, because of the way they're updated. These are set up to install per user. They don't require admin rights. Any user can install one of these. Generally, they would come from the Windows Store, but they can also be installed manually. In Windows 10 1607, you can actually double-click on a AppX file containing one of these Universal Windows apps, and Windows will ask, hey, would you like to install this? Why, yes, I would. And go ahead and install at that point. So installation is per user, but we also have a process called provisioning. That provisioning of an app marks that app as registered on the machine to automatically install for every user who logs into that device. So provisioned apps show up on every single user. So we always see users who say, IT people who say, we're going to create an image and I'm going to uninstall these apps because I don't want them. They uninstall them as part of the task sequence by running PowerShell commands. They sysprep, they capture the image, they deploy it, and guess what? The apps come back. Because they didn't deprovision the apps, they just uninstalled them from the current user. So they're still provisioned as part of the operating system. Therefore, they install for every user after that OS is deployed. So if you want to get rid of them, you have to deprovision them. We'll take a look at how to do that in a moment. You can remove pretty much all of the inbox apps. There are a few exceptions to that, like Edge and the Store and a couple others that escape me at the moment. So there are some that can't be removed, but 95% of them can be removed from the operating system. Once they're deprovisioned from the OS, then they won't come back again at any point. A lot of people will ask, well, can I update the inbox ones? Because we need to install updated app versions as soon as the OS is deployed. And you can, but it's probably not worth the effort, because these apps are updated so frequently that even if you installed later versions as part of your image, assuming you deploy that image more than a week later, those app versions are already going to be out of date. So it doesn't make sense to try to keep them up to date. They will get updated automatically from the internet using the Windows Store to download the Delta. This is a Delta upgrade process to just pull down the changed pieces of those applications to bring those up to date. Now, we do have the ability to add more, so you can go out to the Windows Store for Business or talk to your friendly local ISV and say, I want the AppX file for this particular app, provision that into the OS image so that when your image is deployed, that app automatically installs for every user. We'll take a look at how to do that, but that's not terribly difficult to do. You just have to get the necessary pieces, including all the dependencies, together and install that as kind of a bundle into the OS. We used to have the limitation that I mentioned yesterday, saying that we can't sysprep and capture a new image if we've upgraded that from a previous OS release. We now support that, so you can take a Windows 10 1511 OS, upgrade it to Windows 10 1607, sysprep it, capture it, and then deploy that image. If you're going to use MDT, though, don't do it. It's going to be much better to just drop in updated installation source files and then rerun your task sequence to create a new image using that latest set of install files. So this is really intended for the smaller customer who It's amazing that they ever created an image in the first place. Now they don't really want to spend the time to go back through the 50-page document that they used to create that image manually in the first place. They want to easily upgrade that to the latest version without going back through that 50-page process. Well, we want to enable them, but still, hopefully you don't have a 50-page process. You have a task sequence that's effectively self-documenting, showing here are the steps that we execute to create an image. So that gets us to the starting point. And when we say starting point, we're assuming that we're starting from MDT. So on this particular server, in this case, this is Windows Server 2016. I have Windows Server 2016 running the ADK for Windows 10 1607 and MDT installed on top of that. Just like every ADK version before, we need to add a certain set of components to support this. We need Windows PE, we need the deployment tools, we need USMT in order to get the necessary tools pulled into MDT to do that. We obviously then need a deployment chair to hold all of the different pieces that we're going to assemble together into an image. So I already have one of those. And the first thing that we would do into that deployment chair is import a set of operating system source files. So in this case, I've already got Windows 10 1607 in here and Windows 10 1511 because I do a lot of upgrade testing, so I'm routinely deploying 1511, upgrading it to 1607, and then wiping it out and starting over again. So it's useful to have the full set of source files as the starting point to use here. So we would start at that point, and then we can create a task sequence. So let me create a new task sequence, call it demo, call this the Ignite Australia image. It's a standard client task sequence, so we can use the default there, and I'll select Windows 10 Enterprise 1607 x64, and take the defaults, except in places where I actually have to type something. So we'll stick with Contoso. I need an administrator password. And then we have a task sequence. So at that point, we have a task sequence that's capable of booting the PC, deploying Windows 10 1607 x64 to it, and sysprepping it and capturing it as a new WIM. So we haven't made any customizations. The default task sequence will do those particular activities. So that becomes the starting point. There might be some tweaks that we want to do to this initially to enable some things that are disabled by default. Like if we wanted to point to Windows Update, we could go in and uncheck to disable that step, and it will begin to run. There might be some things that we want to tweak with the formatting and partitioning. Generally doesn't really matter that much for image creation processes, but I'd mentioned before that we have two steps now, one for BIOS and one for UEFI. So it's checking the task sequence variable, and then it has an explicit layout for a BIOS-based machine for 3 partitions. Even though we're building an image and we don't really care about partition layouts because we're just going to capture the OS drive, it doesn't hurt anything to create those additional partitions, even for image creation. If by chance we're using a UEFI virtual machine to do this, like Hyper-V with the Gen 2 VM, then we would format and partition the disk using UEFI. But the same thing, we're going to use that Windows partition, the primary partition that takes up most of the disk size. That's where we're going to deploy the OS, and that's where we're going to capture it from. It makes absolutely no sense to enable BitLocker as part of a image creation process because, well, eventually you're going to sysprep the OS. That disables the protectors. You then reboot into Windows PE. You capture the unencrypted data, so don't do it. It just slows the whole process down. So that's where we're starting from. From there, we want to start doing some customizations. So what's the first customization that we probably want to do? Let's get rid of some apps that we don't want. So we have all of these inbox applications. Any of these inbox applications, except for the few exceptions that I mentioned, can be removed. I posted a blog that explained how to do that, actually a couple of blogs, and let's just walk through the steps that are necessary to do that. So the first step is to check out the blog. So let's see if I've got a browser window open here with it. So I posted a PowerShell script. The PowerShell script kind of explains, takes care of the work, but the blog goes into the details about why you'd want to remove applications. In some cases, it's because you don't want them. In other cases, you might just want to make the whole deployment process faster. So we can take that script and then add it into the task sequence. Now, the nice thing about Universal Windows apps, UWP apps, is that they can be removed online and offline. When we're saying online, we mean with the operating system running. So you can boot into the OS, you can then see what apps are present, and you can then remove them one at a time. Offline means the OS isn't running. So we could, if we really wanted to, mount the install.wim, remove the apps, commit the changes, and use that as our starting point. But that's kind of a manual step, so it's easier to do this offline as part of the task sequence, but before the OS boots up for the first time. So in this, we talk about the differences to say, well, why would you want to do online versus offline? Well, you want to do offline so that you can avoid those background processes that start updating applications. If we do it offline, we can make sure that works before Windows Update can get involved and start installing fixed or updated versions of the apps. There are a couple of complications that are called out in here, like setting the PowerShell execution policy and related things like that. So let's just walk through that process and set that up. So I want to remove it offline because I enabled Windows Update. I want this particular task sequence to be able to reach out to the internet, and I don't want to have to worry about app updates getting in the way of my task sequence. So the things that I want to remove, I can remove them after the image has been installed, and the image is actually installed by this step, where we install the operating system. But I want to do it before we restart into the full running operating system. So at some point in here, I can add an additional step. After inject drivers works reasonably well. So I'll say I want a run command line step here. And because you really don't want to see me type some of these command lines, let me set up a step to set the PowerShell execution policy. Because I want to set that to unrestricted because my script's not signed. So there's the first step. And then I'll add another step after that. Demo, enable scripts. PowerShell by default won't enable you to run any scripts. Put in the command to do that. So we're just poking in registry values into Windows PE in this case so that we can get to the point where we can then run a PowerShell script. So step number 3, run a command line. To remove apps. And the command in this case is to run PowerShell.exe to run the removeapps.ps1 script. Now that particular script is what we had downloaded from that blog. It's an attachment at the end of it. So downloading it's one step in the process, but there's some other stuff that we want to do first. So we've got those 3 steps in there, one to set the execution policy, one to enable scripts, and one to actually remove the apps. But before this will actually work, we have to make sure that we put the script on the deployment share. That's easy enough. And we might want to restrict it so it doesn't remove every single app. If you read through the blog, it says, well, by default, what's it going to do? It's going to remove every single app. And as much as you might dislike these inbox Universal Windows apps, I can bet you that there's at least one of them that you don't want to get rid of, like Calculator. Calculator's useful. Keep it around. The others, okay, you can go through the exercise of figuring out which ones you want to get rid of, which ones you want to keep. But the script is set up so that it will read in a list of apps that you want to remove, and it'll only remove those that are in that list. But you don't really want to have to type in that list or figure out what that list is. So the script, when it runs, will actually write out an XML file that contains, actually it's a text file, but it contains a list of all the apps that it found and removed. So we can actually switch over to a client. In this case, I've got a virtual machine. This virtual machine was running a task sequence to deploy Windows 10 1607 to this particular VM, normal MDT task sequence. While it was running, I hit the F8 key to open up a command prompt. That means once it gets to the point where it's going to reboot into the full OS, it's not going to go any further until I exit out of this command prompt. So if we look around at this point, we have a disk that has some stuff on it. In this case, the D drive actually contains the operating system that's already been deployed. The nice thing about that is that we can then run a simulation of, well, what would happen if we ran that particular script on this OS that's in the process of being built. So let me map a drive back to my server. Go to Users, Administrator. I think that's the right location. Just to save myself some typing, let me confirm that. Yep, that's right. So that's where I put it. If we look in there, there's the remove apps.ps1 script. Now, if I were to go into PowerShell, I can try to run remove apps.ps1. Of course, I get an error back saying that you can't run it because I haven't enabled scripts or execution policies. So we do set execution policy bypass for now, and then run the script again. Now remember, I said the default behavior is that the script is going to remove every single app from the operating system and write out a file telling you what the apps were that it removed. So we had to wait for that to finish, and when that finishes, then we can look at that list and remove the entries that we want to keep, so we can be a little bit more selective about what gets removed. So we'll let this run through. Since there are quite a few apps that it is removing, it does take 30 seconds or so to go through this process. And once that's finished, it will deposit a file in the temp folder that we can take a look at. So we'll give that a moment. Standard PowerShell challenge that we can't really see what it's up to, but it is busy doing its thing. Everyone count to 10, then maybe it'll be done. There we go. So it's done. If we switch over to the X drive and go to, actually let me exit out of PowerShell. Go to %temp. Always helps to be in the right folder. So we can see removeapps.xml. Which isn't really an XML file. It's a list of app names. So those are all the apps that it removed. If we wanted to be a little bit more selective, we could say, let's leave some of these behind. So removing the desktop app installer, that's the app that actually processes the double click on an AppX file. So you probably don't want to remove that one. 3D Builder, maybe, maybe not. Bing Weather, maybe, maybe not. Getting started, that app is useful for training people, so we'll leave that one. So you can just go through and figure out which ones you don't want. A lot of people don't like the Xbox app, so we can get rid of that one. Maybe you don't want Zune Video, so you can remove that from the list. So basically you just filter this list down to what you actually want to remove. In this case, the Windows Communications app, that's the mail and calendar. Maybe you want it, maybe you don't. So you just selectively figure out what you want to keep and what you want to leave. So we can save the changes to that file. Now that file currently is only on the RAM disk for Windows PE. If we want that to be used for our deployment, we can copy that to the deployment share scripts folder. XML file. There's already one there, so we can overwrite it. And then we need to copy the script itself, which was at Y, remove apps, to that same location. Now we have everything we need to run this as part of the task sequence. So at this point, I can throw away this virtual machine because I don't really need it. I'm just using this to kind of warm up for the real creation. But since I'm going to use this for some other demos later, we'll let it sit for now. But now we've got everything that we need in place for those task sequence steps that we had added. So setting the execution policy, enabling scripts, and then running the removeapps.ps1 script, which will read that removeapps.xml file to control then what apps actually get removed. So that's the simple way of getting rid of those inbox apps. The next step would be, well, maybe we want to add an app. So there are plenty of apps available. You can get the installation files for a lot of these applications through the Windows Store for Business. Any app that's available through the Windows Store that has been enabled for offline use, where offline use basically just means you can download the installation files and an XML license file that allows you to install that on as many machines as you want. Any of those apps can be added into your image so that you can then deploy them as part of the image. So there's a blog out there that talks about how to do that. There was logic added to MDT 2013 Update 2 to support the installation of these apps. So you just specified the name of the AppX file, and MDT would know that, oh, I need to build a DISM command line to install this for you. It was somewhat broken in MDT 2013 Update 2, fixed in MDT 8443, so that they now will install successfully. So let's look at this starting from the perspective of the Windows Store for Business. So let me switch over to my server here again. If you go to www.microsoft.com/business-store, it will take you to the sign-in page. You can sign up from here if you haven't yet created an account, or you can go ahead and sign in. This does require an Azure Active Directory account, so you need to at least have an Azure Active Directory tenant with one account in it so that you can sign into the store. The first person who signs into the store needs to be the global admin for that AAD tenant because they need to accept the terms for the store, and only the global administrator can do that. But once you've done that, you can sign in and do whatever else you need. If you're using Office 365 already, you've got all of this handled, you've got Azure AD in place. If you aren't, well, you could create an AAD tenant in a few minutes through Azure and create at least one account in it so that you can sign into the store, and that's really all you need. At that point, you can get the apps that you want. In this case, I've already got apps that I've added into my inventory. So if I look at the inventory for my particular tenant here, we can see the list of apps. I've actually got 6 apps that are available for online usage, which means I can distribute them through Intune or through direct assignment to different email addresses. Or I've got another 6 that are available for offline use. Those offline licenses are what we can download and install as part of our images. So I can go ahead and filter this list just by checking the offline box, and it will show me only the offline apps. So if I wanted to do something like include Delve in my image, I can select Delve and then see all of the pieces for this particular application. Looking for Windows x80 or Windows 10 desktop, x86 or x64. In some cases it could be different, in other cases it's not. I can download the main package, which is the Delve app itself. So let me go ahead and click on download on that one, and I will save that to a folder. So I'll put that file in the folder. That is actually an AppX bundle file, so that bundle contains all the necessary pieces for that application in all the different languages. I then need a license for that. I believe I need an unencoded license, which gives me an XML file. So I'll generate that, which is an XML file. That's good. Save that to the same folder. And then I need the required dependencies. In this case, framework packages that contain the runtime libraries that this application uses. Two of these are x86 libraries, the VCLibs and .NET Native, and the other one is an x64 equivalent of one of those. So I need to download all 3 of those, but I need to structure them in a way in that folder that MDT understands. MDT understands the normal folder structure that would get created by Visual Studio when you build a Universal Windows app. And that would be, so when we download this one, let me save that as, and create a new folder called Dependencies. And inside of that, create a folder called x86. And I will save that x86 file in that particular folder. Download the second one. Put it in the same place, because it's also an x86 file. And the third one is an x64 file, so that one needs to be placed elsewhere. So that one can go in Dependencies, x64. And then we have all the pieces that we need for that particular application. Now at that point we can go into Applications, say that we want to create a new one, an application with source files. And we'll just call this one Ignite Australia. Specify the folder that we created with those downloaded files. here. Oops. Australia. It'll create a folder on the deployment chair. That's good. For the command line, this is another one of those messy points in MDT. So we need to go to the folder where we downloaded it. And the command line is the name of the file. So the easiest way of getting the whole long name of the file is copy and paste from File Explorer, where I can then paste it into MDT. So that sets up the application. At that point, if we wanted to add it to our task sequence, we can go to task sequence, in this case into the state restore phase, because we can load this one online without any issue. We can add a step there to install an application. Select the application that we just created. Fix the name. And that's all we need to do. So we can repeat that process for each application that we want to add into our image. Now that particular application, the Delve app, is a universal Windows app. It is a fully modern application, but you can do this exact same thing with a desktop bridge app. So as ISVs package their app using the desktop bridge, it creates an AppX file that they can submit to the Windows Store for Business. Once it's submitted to the Windows Store for Business, as long as they make that available as an offline license, you can deploy those desktop applications exactly the same way as you install a modern universal Windows app. So pretty easy to handle the desktop bridge applications in the same way. So let's assume that we removed apps, which we just did, and that we then want the start menu to look somewhat reasonable. In order to do that, we need to do some cleanup, because the default start menu will end up with holes in it where those particular icons used to be. Even more importantly, there are placeholder icons that are in the default start menu layout, like 10 of them. Each of those placeholders, when the user signs in for the first time, ends up getting replaced by some app that the store is going to offer based on the region of the world that you're in. That's where you get things like Candy Crush and Twitter and other apps being offered to the PC. It's not that they're contained inside of Windows 10. It's that those placeholder tiles are to be replaced by the Windows Store when the user signs in with something that is pulled down. Now you can turn those off. There is a policy in Windows 10 called the Turn Off Consumerization Features policy. That's supported on Windows 10 Enterprise and Education. If you set that policy, then it's not going to download any of those, but those placeholder tiles will still be there. So regardless of whether you're going to set that policy or not, you want to get rid of those placeholders so you don't have these weird-looking empty tiles in the start menu. So let's look at a different machine. I've got another virtual machine here. Which will show you what I'm talking about. This is the default start menu layout. And this particular machine, I'm logging on as the administrator account, so it doesn't have the ability to download any apps to replace those placeholder files. Those placeholder tiles are the ones with the little down arrow with a line underneath it. Each of those should be replaced by an app that is offered through the Windows Store. And looks like there's 11 of them, not 10, but we can get rid of all of those. So if we create a custom layout that doesn't have those, and also removes any of the icons that are tied to the apps that we've removed. We can clean this up a lot. So if we're going to remove the Xbox app, well, then we don't need that on our start menu. We don't need any of these placeholders, so we can just go through and unpin each one of those. So we're just customizing the layout manually in this case to look the way we want it to look. What that ends up being is going to be up to each of you, but we probably want to start with something nice and simple. Maybe we want to get rid of Skype. Maybe we want to keep the store, but we want it to be a smaller icon. We can do that as well. We could collapse groups, get rid of Groove. Don't need a Get Office. Don't need a Get Office offer here, so we can get rid of that one. OneNote's not a bad thing to have. We can leave that one around. And let's get rid of Movies and TV and the group that went along with it. The labels, we could also change those. By default, it says Life at a Glance. Maybe we just want to have this one be Common Apps or something like that. Maybe we plan on using Outlook, so we don't want Mail. We can get rid of Mail. We could get rid of Calendar. So we end up with a fairly basic start menu layout. Once we have the layout that we want, we can export it. So to export it, we use PowerShell again. So let me run PowerShell. And then run export start layout to a particular path. So I'll just write it to this directory. Let's call it, what should it be called? Let's call layout.xml. If we look at what's in that file, it is nothing more than a text representation of what the layout for the start menu should look like, specifying the size of the icons. In this case, 2 by 2 is a medium-sized icon. What column should it be in? What row should it be in? And then the app user model ID specifies, well, what's this pointing to? So in this case, we've got Edge, Photos, the Windows Store, and OneNote in this layout. Once we have that XML file, we can copy that to our deployment chair. And from our deployment chair, then add a step into the process that places that in the default user profile. Once it's in the default user profile, then it becomes the default for every new user that signs onto the machine. So I've already copied that file over to my deployment chair with a slightly different layout because I didn't recreate it exactly. If we switch over to the server and look on the deployment chair, the scripts folder, let's see, what did I call this thing? There it is, layout modification. So that's the XML file containing the layout that we want. We can then add a step into the task sequence to copy that into the right place just in time. So you would normally see instructions on TechNet that would say, well, you make the layout modification, you then sysprep it, you capture it with copy profile, and then it automatically is in place. But I really don't like copy profile, so it's much better to copy it into the default profile as part of the task sequence. So in this case, again, you don't want to see me copying these things, so we can just add a step that does an X copy of that layout modification.xml file to our target partition into the user's default app data local Microsoft Windows shell folder. That's where it would end up if you were using copy profile. So we just need to make sure that it's in that folder before a real user signs on for the first time. And then they'll get that as the default. So we'll copy that command line and we'll add a step right after we've removed the apps. Again, without the operating system running, because We don't really care if it's running or not. We just need to get that file into the right place. So we'll copy it from our deployment share script root folder into that long path in the OS. So with that step in place, we now get a start menu layout, minus all the extra stuff. So that's always useful to do, to get rid of the placeholder tiles and to get rid of any blank spots that would have been there because of the apps that you removed. The next step would be, well, what about the taskbar? One of the things we added in Windows 10 1607 is we can customize the taskbar by pulling stuff out of it or even just completely replacing the taskbar layout with something custom. So to do that, we use that same XML file. So there's a reason I called it layoutmodification.xml. That's what what Explorer looks for when it starts up to see what it should process. But we can take the start menu layout and then merge in the additional the additional XML to configure the taskbar, and both of them will be taken care of at the same time. So when the user signs in, they get the nice and small start menu layout, and they get the taskbar layout that we've added to it. So if we look at that XML file again, this time the one that's on the deployment share, we can see that I've added some things here. I've added, after the start menu layout that I specified, in this case with 2 icons in it, one for Edge, one for Cortana, and a name of good stuff. I've added a taskbar layout that says I want to replace the current taskbar, and I will put on that taskbar an icon for Microsoft Edge and for File Explorer. So those are the only 2 icons that I want to end up with on the taskbar. Now, getting this particular piece to work took me like 2 days, because read through the TechNet documentation, it sounds like, oh, this is really easy. I can go out, I can export the start layout, I can add some entries to it, save it, and everything will work just fine. No, it's not quite that simple, primarily because of these XML namespaces at the top. Because the start menu uses one set of XML namespaces, the taskbar uses a different set of XML namespaces. So in order to do both of them at the same time, you need to have both sets of XML namespaces in the file. So my suggestion is follow the TechNet documentation exactly that gives you an example of how to do the taskbar configuration, and then paste your customized sections into it, replacing the groups that are in the default layout for the start menu and replacing the taskbar icons with the specific ones that you want in there. Then you don't have to worry about namespaces because you're copying and pasting from TechNet. Those work fine. Otherwise, you'll tear your hair out trying to figure out, how did I get a start menu that was customized and not a taskbar? Well, it's very picky about XML namespaces. But we've got that in place. We've got a step to copy that in already, so one step taking care of both of those. So the next thing generally is configuring default apps. To configure default apps, we really want to be able to specify what applications are used for certain things. A good example is PDF. If you look at the default on Windows 10, the default PDF viewer is Edge. If you want that to be Adobe Reader, you have to reconfigure the defaults. The easiest way to do that is manually. So we can go to a machine and just reconfigure the default apps. So let me go back to the machine that we configured the start menu on. We can go into settings. Choose a default app for each type of file. And then for these, we can choose what the default app should be. So if we look through this, we could find an entry for PDF pointing to Microsoft Edge. If I had a different PDF viewer installed, I could choose that instead. I don't happen to have that in this case, so let's choose something else like .tiff, because I do have multiple apps that are able to view TIFF files. So the default is Windows Photo Viewer. Maybe I want to use the Photos app instead, or Paint, but regardless, I can just choose whatever app I want to be the default for that particular file type, and then exit out of the Settings app. So that changed it for me as the logged on user. Now I would want to export that using DISM into an XML file. So if I, helps to have a command prompt to do that from. So DISM online export default app associations. And I think I had to tell it where to put them. Let's see what it says about that. Yep, give it a file name. Ooh, big typo in that name, but that's okay. Let's just look at it as C:\AOOS. So there's a list of all the file associations. If we search this for .tiff, we can see that it's associated with a program called PBrush, which is Paint, and we can then take that XML file, again, copy it into our deployment share, and then do the opposite, which is DISM import default app associations. So if we go back over to our server, we can add a step into the task sequence. And I really don't want to type that from scratch. So again, we can do this offline. So in the offline case, we just have to tell it where the OS is. But I can run DISM, So in my task sequence, I can add another command line step. To run DISM import default app associations, pointing it to that assoc.xml file. I did a similar configuration to that before. All this demo, set file associations. And then we have one other custom step in the task sequence. So we're really just kind of working through the normal configuration options. Assuming you're not running into some of the bugs that we had in early Windows 10 releases, it'll pick up that set of default associations. They'll be used as the default when new users sign in. The only gotcha would be if you wanted to change one of those defaults after the user signed in, because the only way that can be done is by the user themselves or via group policy. You can push out a GPO with a separate XML file saying, here's the associations that I want. Language packs used to be easy. With Windows 10, they're a little bit more complicated because we've made them more complicated in an effort to make them smaller. So instead of having one language pack file that contains everything you need for that language, there are now several different pieces. There's the language pack itself, and then basic OCR, handwriting, text-to-speech, speech, and sometimes font packages. So in order to add support for a particular language, you need all of those different pieces. So you need to download all of those, and once they're there, MDT can be used to install the language pack, but it doesn't know anything about those other 5 or 6 pieces, so you have to import those into your deployment share, and MDT is going to look at them and say, ooh, those look like updates. I should inject them just like a normal update, which is great if you want all of them to be added to your image, but if you wanted to be more selective, then you need to create folders and selection profiles, and for each task sequence, say which ones you want. But we can take a quick look at what that looks like since we're starting to run out of time. If I look on my server here, I've downloaded from the Volume License Servicing Center a ISO that contains all the language packs for Windows 10. I've mounted it on my virtual machine so that I can see inside of that ISO and look at the language packs folder and see language packs and language installation packs. So if we scroll through here, we can see, say, Spanish, the client language pack x64 ESES, that is the Spanish language pack. But we don't see any of those other pieces because they're not in this ISO. They're in a different ISO. So to get those other pieces, you need to download the Features on Demand ISO. And let's mount that one real quick. Features on Demand. That has all the other pieces. So we'll go back into Explorer, look on this one, and now we can see all that extra stuff. So we've got the basic pack for Spanish. And if we scroll down a little bit further, we then have fonts. I don't think Spanish has any extra fonts, so we don't have to worry about fonts. We do need to worry about handwriting, so there is a package for handwriting recognition that needs to be imported. There is an OCR so that we can do text recognition on Spanish, so that needs to be imported. There is a speech one, so that needs to be imported. There's a text-to-speech one, so Windows knows how to talk in Spanish. So you really just need to go through all of these and grab all the pieces that are needed for that language and add them all into your image. I've already done that for this particular deployment chair. So if we look under Packages, I created a Spanish folder, ESES, where I imported the language pack itself, which MDT will then give you an option to install as part of the task sequence, as well as the 5 other chunks that need to be injected into the operating system. If you notice too that there was a package there at the end of this list for .NET 3.5, so if you need to add .NET, the .NET framework into your operating system, the 3.5 version, you can import that into MDT and inject that as well. So when we put all that together, we end up with a task sequence that can create a Windows 10 image that does all those things. Remove inbox apps that we don't want, add additional apps from the Windows Store. You probably already know how to handle standard Win32 apps, so we didn't really need to get into that. You can configure the start menu with a layout just by deploying your image to a machine. Maybe it's not the final image, doesn't matter, but use that then to configure the layout how you want it, export that to an XML file, and then have the task sequence copy that XML file into the right place. Same thing with the taskbar. Configuring the default apps, same basic thing. Manually configure the file associations you want, export them using DISM, import them as part of the deployment task sequence using DISM, and then add in any language packs that you want. So you could do this all on top of the install.wim without a custom image, but in a lot of cases you'll want to save time by doing this through a custom image. So if we look at final result, we've got the task sequence that I was building. I've also got the original golden image, which was the one that I used to prove that all this stuff works. But exact same steps created in there to add those specific customizations and the application. On the build machine then, we just need to say that we want to select that task sequence. Oops. So we could choose our Ignite Australia image, start the whole process, and hopefully come back in an hour or two and see that we have a custom image with all of those customizations in place. That was our Spanish language pack. Already got the apps handled. Since this is an image, we would want to capture a new image of that. And off we go. So that's what we would want to do. Those are the steps that are kind of new to Windows 7. So hopefully you can kind of go back through the recording of this and kind of pick up on the details for that. There are also pointers then to the blogs and the TechNet documentation that covers the details associated with that as well, but that's what you need to do. Then you have your Windows 10 image. If you have any questions, I'll hang around. I'll be here the rest of the week, so look me up. Hopefully that was useful and you don't mind me keeping you over a few minutes. Thanks a lot and talk to you later.